don't record silence anymore. That's the first thing you need to know. I used to be obsessed with the concept of zero noise floor, that perfect, pristine stillness you can only find in the deepest pockets of the wilderness. My name is Simon Keller, and I'm a sound engineer by trade. My job is to capture the ambient world for film scores, meditation apps, and high-end audio libraries. I've spent nights alone in the Mojave Desert and weeks camping on the ridges of the Appalachian Trail without a single incident. I'm a rational man. I understand acoustics, I understand frequencies, and I understand that the human brain is wired to find patterns in the chaos. But what I found in the Pacific Northwest wasn't a pattern. It was a violation of nature. People ask me why I sold my gear. They ask why I live in the city now, right next to a train station where the noise never drops below 60 decibels. I tell them it's for convenience. The truth is, I can't handle the quiet. Because when it's quiet, you start to hear the things that are trying to sound like you. It started in late October. I had been commissioned to capture a particular audio profile, heavy rain on dense pine needles, without the interference of wind or man-made machinery. I scouted a location on a private tract of land near the Olympic Peninsula, deep in the temperamental rainforests of Washington State. It was perfect on paper. The nearest paved road was 12 miles away. The cabin itself was a relic from the 70s, an A-frame structure with a wall of glass facing the tree line, designed to let the outside in. That should have been my first red flag. You don't want to let those woods in. I arrived around 4 p.m. The light was already dying, strangled by a canopy of ancient Sitka spruce and a rolling fog that smelled of salt and decay. I unpacked the Jeep with the efficiency of a man who prefers machines to people. I set up my perimeter. This is standard procedure for field recording. I wasn't just setting up a tent, I was building a sonic net. I placed 2 high-sensitivity condenser microphones about 50 yards out into the tree line, running the XLR cables back to the cabin through a small port in the window frame. I wanted to capture the depth of the forest, the way the sound rolls through the moss. Inside, I set up my station, a field recorder, a laptop for monitoring levels, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones. By 6 p.m. the sun was gone, and the darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a physical weight. I made some coffee, sat in the leather armchair facing that massive glass wall, and put my headphones on. The first few hours were exactly what I wanted. The rain began as a mist, and soon became a steady drumbeat. It was hypnotic. I watched the waveforms dance on my laptop screen. Green peaks and valleys represented the forest's breathing. But around 10 p.m., the readings changed. I didn't hear it with my naked ears. I heard it through the speakers first. It was a glitch. That's the only way I can describe it. On the screen, a sharp, red spike cut through the green rhythm of the rain. A transient noise. In audio engineering, a transient is a high-amplitude, short-duration sound, like a snare drum hit or a twig snapping. I frowned, adjusting the gain. I rewound the buffer in 10 seconds and played it back. Snap. Then a pause. Then a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was the sound of wet fabric rubbing against bark. Something heavy was moving just beyond the reach of the cabin's porch lights. I took the headphones off and looked out at the glass wall. The porch light cast a weak, yellow cone of illumination that died about 20 feet out. Beyond that, just vertical stripes of pine trees fading into gray nothingness. I squinted, scanning the perimeter. My brain cycled through the logical options. Bear? Elk? Maybe a lost hiker. That's when I saw the yellow patch. It was vivid, synthetic yellow, totally out of place against the organic greens and browns of the woods. It was a raincoat. Someone was standing at the very edge of the light, partially obscured by a thick trunk. They were facing away from the cabin, standing perfectly still. I felt a rush of adrenaline, but not fear. Not yet. Just confusion. We were miles from civilization. If this were a hiker, they would be dangerously off trail. I stood up, walked to the glass, and cupped my hands around my eyes to cut the glare. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice sounding thin against the glass. "You okay out there?" The figure didn't flinch. The yellow raincoat didn't rustle. They were frozen. It looked like a mannequin dropped in the middle of the woods. I watched for the rise and fall of shoulders. Any sign of breathing? Nothing. The rain was hammering down on them, but they just stood there, staring into the pitch-black forest, back turned to the warmth of the cabin. A deep, primal unease started to coil in my stomach. Humans don't stand still like that. Even when we stand still, we shift our weight. We look around. We react to the cold. This was absolute, rigid status. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight, a heavy maglite that could double as a weapon, and unlocked the front door. The cold air rushed in, smelling of ozone and wet earth. I stepped out onto the porch. I said, "Do you need help?" I yelled louder this time. I clicked the flashlight on and swept the beam across the yard. The beam hit the tree where the figure had been. Empty. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I swung the light left, then right. The yellow raincoat was gone, but that was impossible. In the 3 seconds it took me to unlock the door, a person couldn't have sprinted out of sight without making a sound. And the ground was thick with mud. I would have heard the squelch of boots. I stood there for a long time, the rain soaking my flannel shirt, listening. The woods were silent. Not the peaceful silence of nature, but the holding its breath silence of a predator waiting for you to make a mistake. I went back inside and locked the door. I threw the deadbolt. Then I dragged the heavy armchair in front of it. I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by the rain on the glass. Pareidolia, the mind seeing shapes that aren't there. I sat back down at my desk and put the headphones on, needing the familiarity of the work to calm me down. I looked at the waveform monitor, and I froze. While I was outside, while the room was empty, the recorder had been running. There was a new spike on the timeline, right in the middle of the room tone. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the play button. I didn't want to hear it, but I had to know. I clicked play. I heard the cabin door open through my headphones as I stepped outside. I heard my muffled voice yelling into the night. Then the sound of the door was closing. But in the silence between me leaving and coming back, inside the empty cabin, there was a sound. It was soft, wet, and incredibly close to the microphone. An inhalation, sharp, rattling, like air being sucked through teeth. Then a voice, not a whisper, but a mimicry. It sounded flat, metallic, lacking any inflection or gender. It said 3 words. Do. Need. Help? It wasn't asking a question. It was repeating the sounds I had just made outside, testing the syllables on a tongue that didn't know how to shape them. I ripped the headphones off and threw them onto the desk. I spun around, my back against the equipment, scanning the room. The cabin was empty. The loft was empty. There was nowhere to hide. That's when I realized the horrifying truth. The microphone I was monitoring wasn't the one inside the room. It was the shotgun mic outside, the one pointing at the tree line. The voice hadn't been in the room with me. It had been right next to me on the porch. Whatever was wearing that yellow raincoat had been standing just outside the beam of my flashlight, inches away, listening to me scream and learning my voice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the center of the room with a fillet knife I used for cooking, staring at the wall of glass. Every shadow looked like a person. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep. Morning came with a gray, reluctant light. The rain had stopped, leaving the world dripping and exhausted. The rational part of my brain tried to take over again. Lack of sleep causes hallucinations. Stress causes auditory distortion. I needed to verify this. I needed to prove to myself that I was alone out here. I grabbed my camera and went outside. I walked to the tree where I had seen the figure. The mud was churned up, but not by boots. The marks in the dirt were wrong. They were long, smooth drags, like someone had been pulling their feet without lifting them. And the spacing was impossible. The stride length was nearly 6 feet. No human walks like that. I followed the drag marks. They circled the cabin. Once, twice, 3 times. Whoever, whatever it was, had spent the night walking in silent, concentric circles around my shelter, getting closer with every pass. The tracks stopped abruptly near the back of the cabin, right under the window of the bathroom. I looked down. On the ground, arranged with surgical precision, was a circle of dead robins. Their necks were snapped. Their beaks were all pointing inward, towards the center of the circle, and in the center lay a single object. It was one of my XLR cables, severed. The copper wiring inside had been pulled out and twisted into a crude, smiling mouth shape. This wasn't animal behavior. This was intelligent, but it felt alien, like something trying to understand a symbol it had seen but didn't comprehend the meaning of. A smile is supposed to be welcoming. This was a threat. I should have left right then. I should have thrown my gear in the Jeep and driven until the gas tank ran dry. But human curiosity is a fatal flaw. I convinced myself that I needed the data. I needed to retrieve the memory cards from the remote mics deep in the woods. Those recordings might hold the answer. I spent the afternoon fortifying the cabin. I covered the lower windows with spare blankets. I checked the locks 3 times. I kept the knife in my belt loop. As dusk began to settle, the fog returned, thicker than before. It rolled off the Pacific like a white tidal wave, swallowing the trees. Visibility dropped to near zero. I was in the kitchen, boiling water for noodles, trying to keep the noise to a minimum. That's when the knocking started. It wasn't a frantic pounding, it was rhythmic, polite almost. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct raps on the front door. I froze, the pot of water trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. Then, from the back door, knock, knock, knock. I spun around. Then, from the side window, knock, knock, knock. It was moving impossibly fast. Or there was more than one of them. I grabbed the flashlight and the knife. I moved to the center of the living room, away from the walls. "I have a gun," I lied. "Leave immediately." The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. The cabin groaned as the temperature dropped. I looked at the front door, waiting for it to burst open. But the next sound didn't come from the door. It came from the glass wall I hadn't covered, the massive triangular window at the top of the A-frame, nearly 15 feet off the ground. A soft, wet squeak, like skin dragging against glass. I slowly lifted the flashlight, aiming it up toward the apex of the ceiling. The beam cut through the gloom of the loft and hit the window. She was there. The woman in the yellow raincoat. She was clinging to the outside of the glass, 15 feet up, holding on with fingers that looked too long, too pale. But it was her face that stopped my heart. She was pressed against the pane, smashing her features flat. Her eyes were wide, lidless, staring down at me with a biological intensity that felt radioactive. And she was smiling. But it wasn't a smile. It was a gash. Her lips were pulled back so far that I could see the gums, pink and glistening. Her jaw hung slightly askew, as if unhinged. It was the expression of someone who had seen a picture of joy, but didn't know what muscles to use. She didn't blink. She just tapped the glass with one long finger. Tap. And then, through the glass, muffled but audible, she spoke. "I have gun." She was repeating my lie back to me. I didn't scream. The terror was too absolute for sound. My throat seized, locking the air in my lungs. Above me, the woman in the yellow raincoat shifted her weight on the glass. The friction sounded like a wet finger squeaking across a balloon. She wasn't holding on with any visible leverage, no footholds, no ropes. She was adhered to the surface like an insect. Then the lights died. It wasn't a flicker. It was a hard cut. The generator out back gave a final, choking cough and surrendered to the silence. The cabin plunged into a darkness so heavy it felt granular, pressing against my eyes. The only illumination came from the faint gray wash of the moon struggling through the fog outside, casting the A-frame window into a pale, ghostly silhouette. The shape on the glass was gone. I stood in the center of the pitch-black living room, swinging my flashlight wildly. The beam cut through the dust motes, hitting the sofa, the dormant fireplace, the empty kitchen counter. "I'm leaving," I whispered to myself. "I'm leaving right now." My car keys were on the hook by the front door. To get them, I had to cross 20 feet of open space. I took a step, the floorboards groaning under my boot. Then I heard it. It wasn't outside anymore. From the kitchen to my left came a wet and heavy sound. Slap, drag, slap, drag. It was the sound of wet rubber hitting hardwood. She was inside. I hadn't heard glass break. I hadn't heard the lock pick. She had just arrived. The logic of physical barriers didn't seem to apply to her. I killed the flashlight. It was an instinctual choice. If she was navigating by sight, I didn't want to be a beacon. I crouched low, trying to control my breathing, which sounded like a jet engine in my own ears. Slap, drag. She was moving toward the living room. The smell hit me first. Not the clean scent of rain, but something stagnant. Like pond water and copper. Like old pennies. I crawled. I knew the layout of the cabin. I moved on my hands and knees toward the door, feeling the rough texture of the rug under my palms. "I have help." The voice came from directly above me. I froze. She wasn't walking. She was on the loft railing, or maybe the ceiling. The voice was distorted, the pitch shifting violently between high and low frequencies, like a radio dial being spun too fast. "Do you gun?" She cut up my words and twisted my fear. I lunged for the door. I abandoned stealth. I scrambled upright, my fingers grasping blindly for the wall. I felt the cold metal of the key hook. I grabbed the keys, the jingle sounding like a dinner bell in the quiet. Something wet brushed the back of my neck. It was cold, freezing, a long, damp strand of hair. I screamed then. I threw my body weight against the door, fumbling with the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely turn the latch. Behind me, the air shifted. A pressure change. I could hear the wet inhaling sound right at my ear. Whoo. The lock clicked. I threw the door open and fell out onto the porch, sprawling into the mud. I didn't look back. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted toward the Jeep. The rain had turned the driveway into a slurry of mud and pine needles. I slipped, my hand landing in the muck, but I kept moving. The Jeep was 20 yards away. 10, 5. I slammed into the driver's side door, jamming the key into the lock. I ripped the door open and threw myself inside, hitting the lock button before I was even fully seated. I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. The headlights flared on, cutting 2 bright tunnels through the fog. And there she was. She was standing directly in front of the car. The bumper was inches from her knees. The yellow raincoat was slick with slime, but it was the face that broke me. In the high beams, every detail was magnified. Her skin was translucent, blue veins mapping a road map of decay across her cheeks. The smile was gone. Her mouth was now a perfect black circle, an O of surprise. But she wasn't screaming. She was mimicking the sound of the engine. A low, guttural rumble vibrating in her throat, matching the idle of the Jeep perfectly. I threw the car into reverse. The tires spun, spewing mud before catching traction. I shot backward, the front end swinging around. As I shifted into drive and floored it, I glanced in the rearview mirror. She wasn't chasing me. She was waving. But her arm wasn't bending at the elbow. It was rigid, swinging from the shoulder like a pendulum. Back and forth, back and forth. A mechanical goodbye. I drove 80 miles an hour down that winding logging road. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I didn't stop until I hit the lights of the nearest town, 40 miles away. I parked in the lot of a 24-hour diner and just shook for an hour. I couldn't unclench my hands from the steering wheel. I never went back to the cabin. I paid a moving company double to go retrieve my gear 2 weeks later. They told me the place was unlocked, the front door wide open. They said it smelled like dead fish, but nothing was stolen. I sold the cameras. I sold the microphones. I moved into a studio apartment in Seattle on the 4th floor. I keep the TV on all night. I need the noise. But there is one thing I kept. The SD card from the recorder that had been running inside the cabin that night. It took me 3 months to work up the courage to listen to it. I needed to know when she got in. I needed to know how long she had been watching me from the dark corners of the room while I stared out the window. I loaded the waveform into my computer last night. I put on my headphones. I scrubbed the timeline to the moment right before the power went out. The waveform showed my breathing, jagged, panic spikes. It showed the sound of my footsteps pacing the floor. But then I saw a third track. A low-frequency hum runs underneath the audio. I isolated the frequency. I boosted the gain, and I listened. It wasn't static. It was a voice. Soft. Melodic. Right next to the microphone on the desk where I'd been sitting for hours. She was humming a nursery rhyme. Rock-a-bye baby on the treetop. I checked the timestamp. This was recorded at 6:30 p.m. She didn't break in when the lights went out. She didn't break in when I heard the dragging sound. She had been inside the cabin since I arrived. She was in the loft, watching me set up, watching me drink my coffee, watching me lock the door to keep the outside world away. She was already inside, waiting for me to be quiet enough to hear her. And now, sometimes, when the street traffic dies down and my apartment gets too quiet, I can hear it again. A soft, wet humming is coming from the vent above my bed. I don't record silence anymore, because I know now that silence isn't empty. It's just waiting for its turn to speak.